If you have gone through the path of awareness and acquired knowledge, a change in your nature becomes a logical and inevitable finale. When reality refuses to coincide with our expectations, we encounter the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance. The brain tries to preserve the integrity of the internal model, but external circumstances destroy this construction. This is where the true philosophy of existence begins. I began writing this text when I realized that my own brain was exhausted from attempts to control what lies beyond the limits of influence. The amygdala was working at full capacity. The prefrontal cortex was trying to compensate for the chaos with rational schemes, but energy was becoming less and less. Then I turned to the science of how our nervous system actually functions under the pressure of uncertainty. Mentis code philosophy emerged from this experience. I was looking for a way to cleanse consciousness of toxic thinking patterns that were corroding inner calm. It turned out that neuroplasticity makes it possible to rebuild reactions. The locus of control can be shifted through conscious practices. Habituation works if it is given time and space. Every idea that I describe below passed through my own body. I felt how serotonin returned to balance after weeks of regular movement. I observed how mindfulness practice changes the interpretation of physiological signals. I noticed how reframing transforms a narrative from a story of defeat into a story of adaptation. Uncertainty activates the amygdala, an ancient structure that responds to threat. The prefrontal cortex tries to compensate for this reaction with rational analysis, but this is an energetically costly process. That is why a person feels exhausted. However, neuroplasticity allows these connections to be rebuilt. The brain can learn to recognize uncertainty as a neutral state rather than as a threat.
Ancient Stoics understood this mechanism intuitively. Epictetus spoke of the dichotomy of control, separating what depends on us from what lies beyond our influence. Modern psychology calls this the locus of control. An internal locus creates a sense of agency, the ability to influence one's own life. An external locus generates helplessness, but true wisdom lies in understanding intermediate states. Most situations contain elements of both poles. We can change our attitude, interpretation, and way of interacting with circumstances. Psychologist Viktor Frankl, having survived concentration camps, formulated the concept of freedom of attitude. Even when external conditions totally limit actions, the inner position remains a space of autonomy. Modern behavioral science confirms this idea through studies of habituation. When a stressor acts constantly, the nervous system adapts and reduces the intensity of the reaction. The organism learns to function in new conditions.
This process requires time and metabolic resources, but it is possible. Difficulties become the new norm, and the nervous system rebuilds homeostasis at another level. Existential philosophy of Sartre adds the concept of authenticity. To live authentically means to accept one's freedom and responsibility for choice. Many people flee from this freedom into conformism or determinism, blaming circumstances. But true strength appears when we acknowledge our role as co-creators of our own experience. Neurobiology of emotions shows that feelings arise as interpretations of physiological signals. Heart rate accelerates, but the brain decides whether it is anxiety or excitement. The limbic system generates an impulse, but the cortex gives it meaning. We can influence this process through mindfulness practice, conscious presence in the moment. Research on neurotransmitters reveals the biochemistry of stress resilience. Serotonin regulates mood and a sense of well-being. Dopamine is responsible for motivation and reward prediction. GABA inhibits excessive activation of the nervous system. The balance of these substances can be supported through physical activity, social connections, proper nutrition, and sufficient sleep. Philosophy becomes practice through understanding corporeality. The concept of resilience describes the ability to return to a functional state after stress. This is the elasticity of the psyche, which depends on many factors: genetics, childhood experience, social support, cognitive skills. Resilience can be developed. Each overcoming of difficulties strengthens neural networks responsible for adaptation. Paradoxically, uncertainty contains the potential for growth. When everything is predictable, the brain works in autopilot mode, using ready-made patterns. New circumstances force the building of new neural connections and activate creativity. Psychologists call this post-traumatic growth.
After a crisis, a person can reach a higher level of psychological maturity, revise values, and find deeper meaning. Meditative practices of the East offer another approach to uncertainty. Buddhist philosophy speaks of anicca, the impermanence of all things. Acceptance of this idea removes resistance to change. Western psychology translates this as acceptance of reality. AC therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, uses similar principles. Instead of fighting unpleasant thoughts and feelings, we acknowledge their presence and move toward important goals. Social psychology adds an understanding of the collective dimension. A human being as a social creature depends on connections with others. Attachment theory shows that secure attachment in childhood creates a reliable base for adult life. But even in the absence of such a base, therapeutic relationships can compensate for early experience. We remain capable of forming new interaction patterns.
The Philosophy of the Absurd by Camus offers a radical solution. Life lacks objective meaning, and precisely for this reason we are free to create our own. Sisyphus, condemned to eternally roll a stone up a mountain, can be happy if he realizes his fate and accepts it. The absurd hero lives fully, despite the absence of guarantees. Cognitive science explains how narrative shapes identity. We tell ourselves the story of our own life, and this story determines who we believe ourselves to be. Rewriting the narrative changes self-perception. The technique of reframing consists precisely in changing the interpretation of events. What seemed like a catastrophe can become a turning point. Failure turns into a lesson. Clifford Geertz, an American anthropologist, wrote about thick descriptions of culture that take context and multi-layered meanings into account. In the same way, life in hardship requires a thick description. A superficial view sees only suffering. A deeper analysis reveals the complex dynamics of adaptation, resource-seeking, rethinking priorities, strengthening the inner core. Neuroendocrinology of stress describes the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Cortisol mobilizes energy for short-term reaction, but chronically elevated levels destroy health. Relaxation practices activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which restores balance. Breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation, and yoga directly affect the autonomic nervous system. Process philosophy of Whitehead views reality as continuous becoming. Nothing is static, everything is in motion. Difficulties are also temporary. They change along with us. This perspective gives hope. If everything flows, then pain will pass and new opportunities will appear. Sociology of Bourdieu introduces the concept of habitus, embedded schemes of perception and action. Habitus is formed through experience and determines our reactions, but it is plastic and capable of transformation. New practices create a new habitus. If we consciously cultivate certain habits of thinking and behavior, they inevitably become part of our nature. Ecopsychology draws attention to the connection between humans and the natural environment. Contact with nature reduces stress and restores cognitive resources. Attention restoration theory states that natural landscapes provide soft fascination that does not exhaust, but replenishes energy. Even small doses of nature have a therapeutic effect. Spinoza's philosophy speaks of conatus, the striving of each thing to preserve its being. This is the basic impulse of life. Even in the most difficult circumstances, conatus acts, pushing us towards survival and flourishing. Trust in this impulse allows us to relax excessive control and let inner wisdom guide us. Positive psychology studies factors that contribute to well-being.
The PERMA model includes positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. Even amid difficulties, one can find moments of joy, immerse in meaningful activity, maintain connections, seek meaning, and set small goals. Well-being consists of many elements, and working with each affects the overall state. Heidegger's philosophy of time distinguishes authentic and inauthentic modes of existence. Authentic being presupposes awareness of finitude, of one's own mortality. This awareness paradoxically liberates. When one realizes that time is limited, it becomes clear what matters and what is secondary. Difficulties remind us of the fragility of existence and thereby help set priorities. Neurophysiology of pain sensations shows that pain has sensory and affective components. We feel the signal and evaluate it as unpleasant. These components can be partially separated through mindfulness practices.
Observing the sensation without evaluation reduces its emotional charge. Psychological pain works in a similar way. Self-determination theory states that people need three basic psychological needs: autonomy, competence, connection with others. Satisfaction of these needs fuels intrinsic motivation. Even when external circumstances limit autonomy, one can look for spaces of choice. Developing skills that help cope with challenges increases competence. Support from loved ones provides connection. Nietzsche's philosophy of amor fati, love of fate, calls not just to accept, but to embrace one's life as it is, to want everything to repeat again, including pain and losses. This is the maximal affirmation of existence. Such a position requires enormous inner strength, but it is possible. Somatic psychology emphasizes the role of the body in mental processes. Emotions live in the body. Traumas leave bodily traces. Working with the body through movement, touch, and breathing helps process what does not lend itself to verbalization. Bodily wisdom often precedes intellectual understanding. Quantum mechanics, with its Heisenberg uncertainty principle, reminds us that some things are fundamentally unpredictable. The attempt at absolute control contradicts the nature of reality. Acceptance of fundamental uncertainty as a feature of being removes the illusion of total manageability and allows living with greater ease. Buber's philosophy of dialogue distinguishes I-thou and I-it relations. In the former, we meet the other as a subject. In the latter, we use as an object. The same can apply to difficulties, as an enemy to be destroyed or as a partner in dialogue that appeared for some reason and can teach something important. Research in gerontopsychology shows that older people often demonstrate greater emotional stability despite physical limitations. They have learned to distinguish the essential from the non-essential and have developed wisdom as an integration of knowledge and experience. Life in hardship accelerates this maturation process. Stoic philosophy returns us to a basic practice: distinguishing our judgments from external events. Events are neutral. We give them meaning. By changing judgments, we change the inner state. Epictetus advised examining every thought. Is this thing really terrible, or do I make it so by my attitude? Neurobiology of learning speaks of memory consolidation. Repetition strengthens neural connections. If one practices a certain way of thinking every day, it becomes automatic. Pessimism and optimism, reactivity and reflection are formed as habits. We choose which neural pathways to strengthen. Yalom's existential psychotherapy highlights four givens of existence: death, freedom, isolation, meaninglessness. Encountering them causes existential anxiety, but can also become a source of authenticity.
Difficulties sharpen these questions and force the search for answers. In this search, a personal philosophy of life is born. Each person forms their own response to uncertainty. There are no universal recipes because each context is unique. But understanding adaptation mechanisms, knowledge about psychic resources, and philosophical perspectives provide support. They create a structure within which one can move, even when the exact road is unknown. Life in conditions of uncertainty and hardship becomes a school of depth. It reveals resources we did not suspect existed, activates abilities that slept in comfort, tests values and filters out the false, forms character through trials. Here, philosophy ceases to be an abstraction and becomes a mode of existence built from real experience of encountering the limits of one's own strength and overcoming them. I finish these reflections with a different nervous system than the one with which I began.
The writing process itself became a practice of Mentis code philosophy. Each sentence required finding a balance between scientific accuracy and the living truth of experience, integrating knowledge about neurotransmitters with philosophical understanding of authenticity. Now I see that toxins of consciousness accumulate imperceptibly. Automatic judgments, outdated beliefs, borrowed reactions create a layer that separates from direct contact with reality. Mental code consists in conscious identification of these layers and the decision to let them go. My practice includes daily checking of the locus of control. The morning question is simple: where do I have real influence today? This sets the prefrontal cortex in a constructive direction instead of letting the amygdala dictate panic mode. Then comes work with the body, because somatic wisdom often knows answers earlier than the mind. I notice that resilience grows gradually, almost imperceptibly. One day you realize that a situation which a month ago caused collapse now provokes only a short stress spike followed by recovery. Neural networks have been rebuilt. A new habitus has formed through repetition of practices. Mentis code philosophy has become for me a way of living in dialogue with reality. I stopped perceiving difficulties as an enemy and began treating them as a partner that asks questions. What does this situation want to show me about my limits? What resources do I still have to uncover? How can I grow through this experience? Amor fati ceased to be an abstract idea of Nietzsche and became a daily practice. Every evening I ask myself, can I embrace today as it was? With all failures, pain, uncertainty? The answer is always yes, but I observe resistance without judgment. I continue to learn from gerontopsychology, although I am still far from old age. Wisdom as integration of knowledge and experience is formed now, in every choice of reaction to a stressor. In every second when I distinguish the essential from the non-essential. In every moment when authenticity wins over conformism. This thought remains a living document of my own process. My Mentis code philosophy evolves together with me, because philosophy of life in conditions of uncertainty requires flexibility. What worked yesterday may need adjustment tomorrow, but fundamental principles remain: trust in neuroplasticity, practice of mindfulness, search for meaning, cultivation of connections, movement toward authenticity.